Hello everybody, welcome to today's webinar. I'm Deepa here and I'll be the moderator for today's session. The topic for today is demand forecasting and capacity planning. So before we begin, a few housekeeping items. All the attendees will be on mute. And if you have any questions, please type them into the chat window and we'll take them up towards the end of the session. And this webinar is being recorded, so in case you miss out on any part of the webinar, please write to us for the recording. And with me, I have Akash Gupta here. He is the presenter for today. Akash has been working with Saviam since 2012, and he's the subject matter expert of resource management here at Saviam. And he's involved in devising approaches and methods that can be adopted by companies to improve their resource planning and scheduling processes. Welcome, Akash.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Deepa, for your introduction. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar on demand forecasting and capacity planning. This is our first webinar in this space, and we're going to be talking about it more in specific relation to the engineering and construction space. Now, to give you a bit of an idea, just a bit of an overview of what we're going to be focusing on today is firstly, kind of focusing on some of the core concepts of demand forecasting and capacity planning. This is going to be a bit of a refresh or a recap on these concepts, and will be under the context of resource management. And we'll then also talk about some of the benefits of these concepts and why, if you accurately are demand forecasting and resource capacity planning, some of the benefits that the PMO or your company can achieve from there. And then the third focus, which will be essentially the main focus and where we want to spend the most of our time, is some of the tips and actionable steps that you can kind of take towards implementing them. So some quick steps that you can take on that will help you kind of short to medium term strategies and planning for it. So I won't waste too much time, I'll just jump right into it. So just a bit of a recap firstly, as I mentioned, we'll be going through some of the definitions. Now, when I talk about resource capacity planning and demand forecasting, we talk about it under the context of resource management. Now, resource management is essentially the efficient and effective deployment and allocation of an organization's resources when and where they're needed. That's the formal definition. And these resources include things like your human resources, but also includes, it can be financial resources, inventory, production resources. More specifically for the engineering construction space, machinery, equipment, vehicles, essentially practically anything that gives you direct output for your company, and you kind of recognize as giving a direct output for the jobs or work that you have that's upcoming. So that's essentially the main focus. So from there, we then go into essentially the holy grail of what we've talked about, which is first demand forecasting. Now, demand forecasting is the process of understanding your future demand as well as the nature of your upcoming work. So it's essentially forecasting any component of work that you have that you currently might have, or that you might have upcoming maybe in a few months, in a year, or any time in the future. So when I say work, I don't specifically just mean projects. Obviously, projects is a big focus of it, so that could be a client or internal projects. But it's also important to recognize non-project work as well, which a lot of the time companies don't have a strong focus towards. So by non-project work, I kind of talk about things like training, regular training that might be happening, or admin work, or essentially maybe business as usual activities. It's essentially anything that doesn't really require to be project management or has a project plan structure to it. They could be just kind of repetitive in nature. They might just be kind of on-hand tasks that might be taken on. But the importance is to kind of recognize them, because when you are doing your demand forecasting, when you're planning for the work that's upcoming, it's not always enough to just record the project work. You need to record all elements of the work or effort that your resources are going to really be spending their time on. So that's one of the focuses, and I really wanted to kind of put a bit of attention to that. Now, the second part is obviously then resource capacity planning, which is the other side of things, the supply side of things. And by the supply side, I talk about specifically the workforce or the resources that you have. So by capacity planning, essentially, we refer specifically to aligning your resources with that upcoming demand that's there. You know, and this includes essentially creating and structuring your resource pool based on that work. So, you know, you want to make sure that you have, firstly, the right number of resources. Obviously, that's the first thing that you want to focus on. And then obviously, then you want to go into a bit more of the details of do they have the right required skill sets? Do they have the right training onto them? Are they available? Obviously, the availability is there, and there might be at least, you know, there might be 5 to 10, or you know, there might be a lot of different criteria or factors that really involve building that capacity planning, and that might involve a number of things. You might build that capacity through either training existing staff or resources, or it might be kind of then even hiring more resources, or essentially maybe offloading, and maybe you might need to get rid of some staff or something like that. So essentially, it's essentially that restructure element. And I have given a quick summary over here. Resource capacity planning really allows you to design your team or your workforce as for the exact commitment level you foresee. So you're not kind of overloading your resources or underloading them in any way. Okay, so that gives you the context of the concepts that we're talking about. Now, a quick recap in terms of some of the benefits that these concepts really give you. What are the benefits of demand forecasting, capacity planning? Why do we require to kind of accurately, or why do we want to kind of spend time on accurately doing these? Now, firstly, I've kind of broken it down into 3 main components over here. When I talk about the benefits, I essentially, firstly, the first one that I think is the most important is it allows you to have the right mix of resources. And by right mix, that could be, again, a variety of different definitions for that. By right mix, and let's say specifically within the engineering construction space, you might have a specific mix of, you know, engineers and contractors for big contracts and projects that you have coming up. You know, the moment you can foresee the work that you have coming up, you can essentially plan and have the right mix of staff. So if you want to have more contractors to full-timers, you can essentially plan for that a lot more beforehand. Or you can have more full-timers, or you might have more you know, contingent workers, or essentially that right employment type mix you can kind of create. Obviously, it's not just for that. You can also then do that for skill sets as well. If you want to have the perfect mix of skills of your staff, if you want to make sure that you know, the X number of people or a percentage of your staff have training on a specific job, you can have that right diversity of skill sets and skills that are there, or the right diversity in terms of you know, also the experience and seniority as well. If you want to have a more seniors to graduates, or more graduates or junior people are a bit more newer or fresh to the company to seniors. So essentially that diversity, it gives you a lot of time and effort to kind of spend time on building that capacity element of it. So that diversity kind of is that exact mix that your company requires it. So, and that's a huge benefit. And I find that as one of the, I think, the core benefits that companies can have. So, and essentially allows them to have that exact right workforce for any of the projects that they have coming up. Now, second one is then, and this is a more of an immediate benefit that you can see, or more of one of the immediate benefits is optimizing your resources. So your resources utilization. This means that your staff won't be overloaded or underloaded, because you're essentially building the capacity and you're taking on the work that you can kind of take on. You're not really overloading or overburning any of your staff, or at the same time, you don't have a large resource pool that's just sitting on the bench and doesn't have any work or any type of you know, any type of work allocated onto them. Now, that also, in the more medium to long term, really helps you to also build your skill sets as well for your resource pool. As I was mentioning before, if you have the demand, if you can forecast your demand a lot beforehand, you can then essentially even spend time to then build up your skill sets or secondary skill sets of your resources that you have. And the bottom line is that it essentially allows you to maximize the profitability without really overwhelming your teams or overloading or really putting way too much effort or work onto them. Now, the third one, and this is a bit more focused and very, very specific for essentially a lot of construction companies particularly, you want to make sure with accurate demand forecasting and capacity planning, you really get out of that constant hiring and firing cycle. Now, you don't have to, let's say, and I'm going to give a bit of an example here. If you have a specific job that's coming up that requires a large number of contractors that are there, what happens in a lot of scenarios, and as a lot of people might be facing, is that a lot of the times contractors that you onboard on for a specific contract, you have to offboard them once that contract ends, and then onboard a new set or maybe the same set for a new contract and offboard again, and that's kind of like an ongoing process. And onboarding and offboarding is obviously a huge cost that a lot of construction companies have to face. Now, with more accurate demand forecasting, capacity planning, that minimizes and that significantly reduces that process or that issue or that cost that a lot of companies face. So what that firstly helps is you can by being able to see the contracts that you have coming up, whether it's your coming projects or your pipeline projects that you have coming up, you can essentially plan and train your staff or your existing staff for that new contract that's coming up. So you might not have to take on a lot of new contractors, or you might not have to bring on new contractors for a specific specialization. So you kind of minimize that time there. Or even the second one is that once you can kind of foresee if there's, let's say, a specific, very similar contract that's coming on to your current one that you're on, you can just essentially take on those same contractors and then transition them onto that new project or new contract that's coming on. So you don't have to essentially offboard them entirely, and you can just kind of transition them onto that, which essentially, again, minimizes some of the expenses and costs that are involved over there. So as you can see, all three of them are kind of connected to each other. Now, I'm going to now jump onto the Nexus, so the third component, the one that I've been mentioning that I want to spend the most time on. Now, tips for really accurately demand forecasting and capacity planning. Now, I'm going to focus on these separately, so elements on how you can kind of forecast your demand a lot stronger and a lot better, and then elements on how you can plan your capacity, and then we're going to kind of then logically then go to the third component, which is essentially merging the two, making sure that you're doing both components comparatively together in a lot more accurate sense. So the first one, forecasting your demand. When I say forecasting your demand, you want to really talk about a lot of the components of tracking your project and non-project work. Now, a big focus of what I'm going to be really talking about is essentially focusing on all the elements of your resources and your project. So when I say your project and non-project work, if you list it over here, things like, as I was mentioning earlier, things like your external projects. So just as an example, I've listed out some of them here. You can see, let's say, external projects could be your any of your client-related projects. So I've put a variety of different examples here, and it can include internal projects as well. But of course, a big focus that you need to be listing out over here, and what I've placed over here is your non-project work too. So things like your annual, your maintenance support or your operations or training as well. But the big one that is, as you can see, is thing that I put in is leave. That's whether it's annual leave, vacation leave, and even though they might not be work per se as such, but they're essentially commitments that your staff or your resources might be placed onto because they might not be available because of the leave that's upcoming. Once you can recognize that makes it a lot easier when it comes to planning and kind of having that full view of things. And I'll kind of show you that in a Gantt chart that I'll have upcoming. But the second type of project work is also then pipeline projects as well. It's important not just to recognize your project and non-project. You want to also have an idea of the tentative potential projects or potential contracts that you might be winning as well, because you want to make sure that you have, I guess, essentially the potential number of resources for any of these pipeline projects that are there. And to give you an idea, is essentially a Gantt chart. Now, whether you're using an Excel document or a system or a software or a tool or anything, Gantt charts, I think, are inevitably probably the most visual and best way to kind of have a look at these things. As you can see over here, I have all my staff listed out on the left-hand side. But then all the elements of work allocated onto them, and I've done a bit of a color coding system to them where purple kind of represents, you know, your client or project related work, while you know, your green kind of can represent the internal work for me, and then I've put red as the immediate, you know, what you call it, leave or vacation type of work, leave or vacation that's there. So I can immediately just have a bit of an idea of all the commitments or all the type of availabilities that I have for my staff through there. So I can kind of forecast that demand immediately, and that's for, you know, all the way up until August. I can kind of have a look at that, and from September onwards I can see it's quite empty. But the point is to kind of have an idea of that. It's also important, as I mentioned, pipeline projects. Sometimes, you know, you can firstly maybe have a color code for pipeline projects if you want to. I specifically have kind of jumped a bit more deeper into that. What you can do is, let's say, if I go into one of these bookings, you can kind of go into a probability sector of it. I've kind of gone into the details of what is the likelihood of, or what is the probability of this project going ahead, whether it's certain, likely, unlikely, and so on. So, you know, you can kind of go into the specifications of that as well, if you really require to kind of record all of those elements. But as you can see, that's all the demand elements of it. You know, we're focusing all on the demand elements, not kind of, you know, kind of keeping it simple, but essentially recording all the different elements as I've mentioned. Now, similarly, you want to do the same with your capacity as well. Your capacity, when I talk about capacity, I've been mentioning this a lot, is in terms of, you know, your firstly your employment type. So if I kind of jump on over here, I could talk about, you know, people from a variety of employment types. So, you know, I have a whole bunch of permanents, part-timers, a contractor, contingent workers as well. So I've kind of broken them down into 3 or 4 ones. Obviously, in most scenarios, a lot of you're going to have a lot more resources there, but just for simplicity's sake, I've just put in about 10, 15 of them. But essentially having, you know, you can see all the different employment types. Obviously, that might not always be the only thing you want to recognize. It also means things like, you know, your elements of skills as well. So let's say if I go into one of the skill sets, you want to recognize all the different competencies that your staff have. So, you know, where they have civil engineering, drafting, electrical. I've just put in a whole variety of different ones. And again, with that whole notion of, you don't want to just recognize one type of skill set, because Anita over here is within the civil engineering sector, or you know, she's an electrical engineer, sorry. You don't want to just only recognize her electrical engineer competencies. You also want to recognize, does she have management skills? What is her qualifications? Also, what is the certifications that are there as well? And you want to essentially record all those components, because you don't really know, you know, the more information that you can record of these people, the better it comes to when you come to the planning component of things as well. So you can allocate them on for different work, or you can kind of utilize their secondary skill set as well. Now, that's one component. Now, you also then want to even record things like their roles. You can also record things like, you know, where they're located, their you know, their employment, what you call it, sorry, their job title as well. That might be important. What the calendar is, are they working a part-time, are they working, you know, Monday, Tuesday, Friday? Essentially, there might be a lot of elements when it comes to your resources to kind of essentially have a good idea of your individual resources, and then essentially your entire resource pool from there. Now, when you have a large number of resources, it's important in terms of how you measure these staff, or how you measure that resource pool that you have. Now, by measurement, it's important of whether you do it in hours, days, but I always really am a big believer in terms of kind of focusing on your FTE, especially within the engineering construction space, where you have a large number of resources that are there. You want to make sure that you measure it in FTE. Now, a quick recap, full-time equivalent is a measurement for the number of hours worked by one employee on a full-time basis. Now, when I say that, you know, I find it to be a lot more accurate than just recording by hours, because when you have large contracts and projects, obviously, if you're measuring in hours, it's going to go into thousands to tens of thousands of hours, which sometimes becomes just a bit irrelevant when you're dealing with such large numbers. FTE kind of gives you that entire number, or that entire focus of the output that's going in just by the number of resources that you have. And the more important part, and the more, I guess, the more focus that I think is important about FTE is that you can kind of measure both your demand element and then the supply element in FTE as well. So you can measure the amount of work that you currently have in upcoming in FTE too. So that measurement between your capacity against your demand becomes a lot more easier to kind of compare and measure as well. Now, I guess I'll jump into that. So when I say measuring the two, and then, you know, it's important to have some very important reports like that, is where you're measuring the capacity against your overall demand. So you can see I have a full capacity of, you know, let's say, and just to kind of give you an idea in this report, I can see I have a capacity of 7.51 FTE. 7.51 full-time equivalent resources, and the demand of my work is 4.43 FTE. So, you know, by having that one measurement or that one, I guess, metric to kind of measure it, I can automatically see that I have an availability of 3.09. And then the moment you do it in hours, it becomes a bit harder to understand in days as well. So, kind of looking at it over here, you can, and going into this example, I can immediately see for the upcoming 2 months, I have a capacity of 7.51 FTE, demand of 4.43, and an availability of 3.09. That immediately gives me a good idea of I guess like, you know, the gap, the skill gap, or the resource gap that I have between my capacity against my demand. Now, I'm going to be spending a bit of time on this report. Now, you want to firstly, the main focus of this report is essentially visibility. Now, to just kind of backtrack a bit, I was talking about demand first, or forecasting your demand first, and then planning your capacity. But the only way to kind of accurately do both of those together is to essentially compare both of those together on a regular basis, and to kind of see them in a future basis as well. So that's what I'm kind of doing here with this report, where you can compare your capacity against your demand and see the essential commitment of time and work that you kind of have upcoming for you. So over here you have a total element of you know, 7.51 FTE for capacity against 4.43 for your demand. But you might want to see it on a week-by-week basis and kind of jump into it on an element on a week-by-week basis. So for example, you know, in the upcoming July 17th week, you can see that my capacity is 7.5, or my demand is 4.95. So availability is a bit less, but I still have 2.5 FTEs available. But then, you know, the week of July 24th, it goes down to 0.14. But July 31st, and this is the ones I'd like to focus on as well, is where you can see the demand is higher than the capacity. So I have about the equivalent of work of about 7.96 FTE. That's the demand of my work, but I only have a capacity of 7.5. So that immediately, you know, gives me an idea that I don't have, you know, I have less number of resources to kind of take on this work for this week. And then I need to make sure that I have, you know, maybe I might need to have to reallocate work, or I might have to maybe hire a casual for that week potentially. That might be a bit overboard, but in a more, let's say, long-term view, where you have, let's say, hundreds of resources for a big contract or a big project that's coming up, you might need to then realize, you know, if you have that if you're forecasting your demand a lot beforehand, you can immediately realize that you need to bring on more contractors or more resources for that job that's up and coming. Again, you know, that's also for the total one, but, you know, you might want to be sorting based on the skills. So you can measure by the exact skill sets that you have, and measure the capacity of the capacity of a specific skill set against the demand of that skill set. If you want to do it, let's say, by the employment type, you can kind of, you know, have a look at how many, what the demand of my part-time, what demand of my permanents are in comparison to the demand of my contractors over here. So essentially, you know, having the ability to kind of compare those two components in a lot of different elements makes it a lot easier when it comes to planning for your staff or building them up for the demand or for the work that's up and coming. Other ones that I've listed out is, you know, things like, you know, the team or you know, what you call it, maybe where they're located or so, but right now I'll just focus mainly towards competency and employment type. Now, from there, you want to have also pipeline projects should be recorded from there too. So, in the expanding it over here, you want to make sure that all your work components are allocated and kind of recorded within this space as well. And then finally, you want to make sure that you can even have a graph as well. Now, this isn't critical. I'm not going to say that, but again, the more focus is to do more accurate capacity planning, demand forecasting, and if you have a graph, that immediately makes it a lot easier to kind of have a very visual view of comparing the two components and maybe even essentially bringing on your management and showing them as well of how that comparison is going. So I'd say, I've been showing for quite a while over here these different reports and screens. Now, I can understand a lot of companies, what they do is they use an Excel document for jobs like this, or an Excel document, maybe a project management tool, but usually those can't encompass or they don't focus in the same way the resource element side of things, because essentially everything I've been talking about is all resource centric. It's all about your resources. It's all about the skill sets, what work they have up and coming, and it's important to have a resource management software for that. And it's whether it's an online scheduler or anything like that, something that's a bit more sophisticated than an Excel document. Now, an Excel document is quite flexible and they are quite easy to use. But once you're dealing with a large number of resources, especially within the construction engineering space, you're dealing with a ridiculously large number of resources and very large projects that you have to deal with. So you require something a lot more complex, a lot more, I guess, that has a lot more ability to kind of take on all the components of work that you have up and coming and all the different type of resources that you have within your pool as well. But obviously, so what we focus on here at Savion is our enterprise resource management tool, where essentially we have built the tool essentially for this space in terms of taking on the more enterprise level side of things. We want to kind of, we don't want to focus on just the teams or just, maybe 10 to 15 resources. You want to focus on your entire divisions or companies where you're dealing with hundreds of staff or hundreds of resources at a time. And it's important to kind of recognize them and to plan them in a way that you can have, you can plan for your up and coming projects and work that's then really, really help for your bottom line, really help for your bottom line, profitability for the company. Because as I mentioned, some of the benefits that you really get from capacity planning, demand forecasting is you can essentially, stop that hiring and firing costs. You can have that diverse workforce that's there, and you can essentially only do that with a very sophisticated enterprise level resource management tool. Now, a lot of the companies that work with us on this within this space are obviously companies like Honeywell, Siemens, ABB, DHL, Konica Minolta, and also a lot of large number of medium-sized companies as well from there. So I'll ask Deepa, do we have any room for some questions? So are we running out of time, or? Yeah.
One question we have here is, so why do you call demand forecasting and capacity planning as the holy grail of resource management?
Yeah, well, I guess that's a good question, and it really draws back to probably the whole presentation over here. The resource management takes on a lot of different components of things. Resource management, we generally tend to focus on just more immediate resource planning and scheduling, or maybe just a bit more in the short, maybe a couple of months beforehand. But it's also, when I talk about demand forecasting, capacity planning, it's the holy grail, because it essentially gives you the foresight, and you can kind of look at the future of the work that's up and coming for you. And having a foresight of that, let's say 6 months, 12 months, 18 months in advance, really changes the game for a lot of these companies. But they can do planning a lot better, save a lot more money with how they plan their staff and their work. And that's why I say it's the holy grail. If the moment that you've mastered that, that's the moment you become a lot more, I guess, efficient and a lot more effective as an organization that conducts projects.
Well, yeah, I think that really explains why it is the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
So I think we'll have to take the rest of the questions on email after this webinar. Thank you, Akash. It was a great presentation. I hope everyone found this webinar useful and informative. If you have more questions or if you want to ask us anything else apart from this webinar, please write to us at contact@savion.com. We also have an ebook that just came out on this topic, and we'll be sending you a download link after this webinar. And we also have a ton of articles on our website. So if you'd like to read more about resource scheduling, resource management, I'd encourage you to visit our website, savion.com. And yeah, so I think I'd like to thank everybody for joining this webinar. Thank you, Akash. I hope to see you next time.
Thanks, Viva.